We begin with breaking news, of course, as war unfolds in Ukraine. This morning, explosions and sirens heard in and around Kyiv. Overnight, Ukraine's defense ministry saying Russian forces have arrived in the capital, and they are calling on residents to make Molotov cocktails and prepare to fight. U.S. officials say Russia has launched more than 160 missiles since strikes began Wednesday night, targeting major Ukrainian cities from 3 sides of the country. Ukraine says Russians have also seized control of the area around the damaged, decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Ukraine's president says so far at least 137 people have been killed, hundreds more injured. Residents are now leaving the country by the thousands and placing the blame on Russian President Vladimir Putin.
To see this happening to the country is just devastating. I just can't believe someone could be so evil.
As for the global response, President Biden announced more sanctions meant to cripple the Russian economy. He also issued orders sending 7,000 more troops closer to Ukraine.
Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Across the U.S., a massive show of support for the people of Ukraine as thousands gather at rallies from coast to coast, and even across Russia. We are seeing protests against the invasion and against President Putin. We have a team standing by to cover it all. Let's get right to NBC News correspondent Cal Perry, who is in western Ukraine. Cal, looks like Russian forces are reaching the capital. What can you tell us about what's happening throughout the country right now, including where you are in Lviv?
Yeah, in the capital, dramatic scenes unfolding as Russian troops, according to the Ukrainian government, are moving in from the north and from the east. It seems clear at this point they have breached some of those outer neighborhoods. There is reports of fierce fighting taking place there as well as in other places across the country. Where I am here, about 350 miles from Kyiv, we are starting to see really an influx of folks who have been displaced from the fighting. The UN says at least 100,000 people have already been displaced. You can count on those numbers rising. Some folks moving towards Poland while soldiers move in the other directions. Bus stations, train stations really starting to fill up. We continue to see a run on cash, people trying to get cash out of ATMs, trying to get to the border. It is becoming more and more difficult to do so. The wait at the Polish border right now, last time we checked, was about 24 hours. So it is becoming an increasingly difficult situation here.
Cal, we're seeing a full military mobilization in Ukraine. Weapons have been handed out to civilians. Officials are encouraging people to even make Molotov cocktails to fight back. What is the resistance like there? What do we expect to see happen as these troops and Russian tanks move into these big city centers?
Yeah, you know, the Ukrainian news this morning was saying that 16,000 assault rifles, according to the government, had been handed out just in the city of Kyiv. We've heard the government say that anyone who is able-bodied, and any able-bodied male, should join the fight, and that all you have to do if you want to join the fight is bring your passport, some form of ID, and in you will go. It is clear that they are trying to increase the number of people engaging with Russian forces as they move around. Look, the Ukrainian army at times, we know, is stopping the Russian advancement, but we just don't have a full picture really on what's happening. And we do know, because we're looking at the video, that Russian troops continue to advance on the capital. So the Ukrainian government doing everything they can to protect the Ukrainian capital, but it is not looking good as Russian forces start to encircle that city.
And Cal, we heard from Ukraine's President Zelensky overnight. He says his country has been left alone to defend itself. He says the international community is not doing enough. What is Ukraine asking for right now?
Harder sanctions. They want those SWIFT transactions to be halted. There is a question here amongst the government, and we've heard the president sort of say this. They want more. They want more from NATO countries. Now, look, Ukraine is not a NATO nation, so it is not applicable to Article 5, where those other countries would have to step in. But neighboring countries are starting to feel the pressure. They're starting to feel what is happening here because, of course, you're going to have that influx of refugees. So the government here wants more to be done. They want those sanctions to be harder and tougher. They want anything to take place because, of course, these are drastic scenes. I mean, it's sort of unbelievable to watch these Russian forces move in on a European capital, and the Ukrainian government is asking anybody to do anything they can at this point.
Cal Perry in Lviv, Ukraine. Cal, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Terrell Jermaine Starr, is also in Kyiv this morning. Terrell, thank you for being with us. As our viewers can see, you're in a car right now driving. You, of course, were not one of the people that was in those lines of traffic we saw yesterday leaving the city. You are still there. I understand, I believe that you're headed with your friend to sign up to fight. Please tell me exactly what you're seeing right now, what overnight has been like for you, what's happening in Kyiv right now, and do you feel safe?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. And right now, this is a very eerie scene. I've been in the Kyiv for going on more than a decade, and it is eerily empty right now. People are right now trying to figure out how to maintain their safety as exodus of people who are leaving Kyiv. Every day, you see people with baggage, roller baggage, going, stuffing their belongings in a car, heading out to the safest place possible outside of the city. Just about a 15-minute walk from where I live, I captured some video of a building that was hit by what I believe was debris from an interceptor that took in a cruise missile or some type of damage. And so I'm not sure about the number of fatalities there. It was just 15 minutes walk from where I am. I'm currently with my friend Andre, who is going to a recruitment center to sign up to fight. He sent his family to Poland. He decided to stay behind and fight for his country. We're heading to that recruitment center right now. He will be one of the many citizens who will be grabbing a gun and volunteering to support the armed forces here.
Terrell, why is it so important for you to stay and fight?
I am a journalist, and my job is to report. This is my first time covering a war. I'm learning it as I go. It's important for people like myself who are regional studies experts to be here and capture what's happening here in Ukraine. And I'm also here, in addition to being a journalist, many of these people, I can't call them friends, they're deeper than that, including Andre. And so I think it's as responsible for me as possible to capture the human toll of what's Putin's aggression is and what that looks like. And this is an example right now of somebody who I dearly love and care for going to a recruitment center to grab a gun and risk his life.
Yeah, absolutely. Terrell, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you said your friend's name is Andre, who's also welcome to speak with us here. I mean, we have been hearing from citizens in Kyiv who...
You hear her?
You can focus on driving, but just feel free to answer this question as well. I mean, we've been hearing from so many citizens in Kyiv who are basically saying, look, we knew this was a threat. We didn't know if it would come to this. We didn't really believe this would be happening actually within the city. We also are hearing things like citizens being encouraged to make Molotov cocktails. I mean, if you really think about the potential for what's coming and your decision right now to drive, to sign up, to fight, I mean, what are you thinking could happen over the next day or so? How are you feeling about it? Do you feel that the Ukrainian people, citizens who are going to pick up a gun, are prepared?
She's asking if you feel like you're ready to fight, and were you really expecting all of this to happen? You can speak.
Well, I'm not looking forward to it, it's definitely, but this is what I say. If we all do within our capabilities, within our limits, everything for the country we dearly love, then we're gonna have victory. We're gonna win. And this is my position, and I'm not lying to myself doing this. I'm not looking forward to this. I don't think I'm emotionally ready to fight, and I'm ready to kill someone. No, but if it comes to that, this is what I have to do. I will certainly do that.
Terrell, do you feel like what Andre just said there, is that the feeling among most people you know there in Ukraine?
Absolutely, yeah. The definite feeling is that, the language that I hear Ukrainians using is that we will not be slaves. You will not turn us into another Russia. You will not make us subjected to you. And so everybody is saying, they're older people, 80 years old, with bad knees. If they have a finger and they can pull a trigger, they'll pull it. When the government said, hey, be ready to throw Molotov cocktails, there will be people with Molotov cocktails ready to fight. If war breaks out in the city, this will be Taliban 2.0. And the Ukrainian forces have been fighting very valiantly, and so the citizens are definitely ready to take up arms, and there are people waiting to get behind. So this is not going to be a cakewalk. They're not going to welcome the Russians with cookies and milk. I'll tell you that.
Terrell Jermaine Starr, we thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We thank Andre as well for talking with us. We're thinking of both of you, and we'll try and check in with you throughout this process. Stay safe.
Absolutely. And Andre, we're thinking of your family. I hope they made it to Poland
safely.
Thank
you about your family. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Now, earlier this morning, the eastern Ukrainian city of Kyiv came under attack.
NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley was live on the air with our colleagues at MSNBC at that moment. Take a look.
I was surprised because we've always heard a low rumbling from outside the city. We did know that there was fighting on the outskirts of the city around the Ring Road, but now, again, that has changed. A new development here, moving into the city. We'd have to go out. Well, we might not go out and check, but it looks as though we're still seeing some traffic circulating. But this was the closest we've heard so far in the last more than 24 hours of bombardment around Kharkiv. Again, as I said, it's never been so close to the center of the city. Right. I don't know if you can hear those sirens wailing in the background. So clearly there's emergency services heading to the scene. And again, we did hear some car alarms going off, which means there must have been a concussion from the blast, which is close enough. Up until now, we've never seen windows shaking or walls shaking or ground shaking. It's always just been sounds, low rumbles, again, from the distance. This is the first time we're starting to hear that. And it sounds as though some bombardment piercing closer into the center. There we go again.
Yeah.
And you hear this car alarms. That might be anti-aircraft fire. Again, we are not hearing, as we did in Kyiv, I believe that's anti-aircraft fire. We are not hearing the sirens wailing for the city. We're not hearing the broadcasting system coming on yet. That is next. That's what happened in Kyiv. Car alarms there. You can hear that, Eamon. This is a new development in this city. This was a relatively peaceful sort of eye of the storm here. We had heard from U.S. intelligence that there was fierce fighting on the outskirts of the city. But again, this is a new development.
Matt did move to a safer location shortly after that. Matt Bradley reporting a little earlier on MSNBC Reports.
Let's now head over to Moscow, where we're joined by NBC News reporter Matt Bodner. Matt, thanks for joining us. So let's talk through some of this from Russia's side. This morning, Britain's defense secretary told the BBC that Russia, quote, failed on day one to take any of its objectives. And he also says 450 Russian personnel have died so far. That's citing UK intelligence. We've not been able to verify that. But have the Russians said anything about casualties, about whatever these objectives were? And how confident is Moscow in capturing the capital city of Kyiv? Is that still what we think is the objective as we continue to watch this unfold?
Thank you, Savannah. Well, let's start with Moscow's objective. It is certainly clear at this point that their objective is Kyiv. They are telegraphing loud and clear that they are in Ukraine to essentially conduct regime change. They want to. They're kind of trumpeting this liberationist narrative, talking about a fascist government in Kyiv that needs to be demilitarized. So, just kind of the same way they're not calling a war, they're not calling it regime change. It's just it's clearly inferable from what they're doing and the way they talk about it. Meanwhile, as they talk about this, they are also claiming that they're running a massively successful campaign. Yesterday, basically directly contrary to everything we're hearing from the Ukrainians, from this British intelligence assessment that you just mentioned, they say that they achieved all of their day one goals. Now, we don't really know what those are. They threw out a pretty high number of Ukrainian military infrastructure facilities disabled yesterday, but they didn't really elaborate too much. They are claiming things such as Ukrainian units are surrendering and throwing down arms in very large numbers, that they're avoiding population centers, that they're not harming civilians. And so they're kind of painting this very neat picture of essentially the most perfect military operation ever run, but they are not admitting any casualties. They haven't brought this up at all. That, of course, also strains credulity. So we're just kind of in this fog of war scenario right now with these statements.
Now, Matt, the Kremlin says that President Putin is expected to meet with his Security Council today to impose retaliatory sanctions on the West. Do we know what kind of measures Russia is planning, how long that operation is going to last, and any reaction or concern from the West?
So we have very sort of little idea what they might do. We just keep hearing that they continue to promise they continue to promise some kind of massive retaliatory sanctions. We've heard at various stages from various officials from the Kremlin on down that Russia's response may not necessarily be symmetrical. So they're going to start looking at things that they could maybe do that would hurt the West, that may not be a direct response to, for example, some of the banking sanctions we've seen. These could be things related to energy or natural resources.
Matt, quickly before I let you go, I have to ask you about some of these really stark images we've seen. Protesters in Russia coming out to city centers. And then in the last 24 hours, we've seen a crackdown on these anti-war protesters in Russia. Talk to us about what's going on there and what the general level of support is like among the population for this invasion.
It doesn't seem to be a necessarily popular move. It certainly doesn't feel like 2014 did when Crimea was annexed, where you would see kind of pro-government demonstrations everywhere. So we saw, of course, some basically initial anti-war protests breaking out in cities across the country last night. They were not the largest protests we've ever seen, but it's important to note, we're not seeing pro-government protests, but they are concerned enough that you now have government propagandists like the head of Russia Today writing things on Twitter like, I want to address all of you Russians who are writing that you are ashamed of yourselves and ashamed of your country. What is it that you're ashamed for? So it's definitely getting someone's attention.
All right, Matt Bodner, we'll be checking in with you. Thank you so much.
Let's bring in NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell in Washington. So, Kelly, let's talk about what's next. Later this morning, President Biden will hold a virtual summit with fellow NATO heads. What's the goal here?
Well, this is a significant development because this will bring together the leaders of the 30 member nations. And this has both a practical and a symbolic importance because after we've just been listening to all that compelling reporting coming from Ukraine, here is an opportunity for the leaders of the defensive organization of NATO to send a message to Vladimir Putin that they are standing together. They are prepared to defend the NATO nations. And that, of course, includes many in the area that will flank Ukraine and Russia, and also looking at how can they help the people of Ukraine. So President Biden will be a part of this conversation with NATO leaders, and this is an emergency summit, if you will, bringing them together virtually. And it's critical that if wars can often be sloppy, they can be unpredictable, they can go in places that people don't intend. We've heard that in some of the reporting already. And there are great concerns about could Vladimir Putin's ambitions go beyond Ukraine? And that would mean potentially into a NATO country. And that changes the dynamic dramatically. Now, we're not saying that that's what's going to happen, but that's a grave concern for NATO members who would have a defensive position. And so we're seeing U.S. military and other NATO countries beefing up their military in the European areas that are along the border here. And we heard from Antony Blinken talking about the concerns that NATO countries have about a common defense. Here's what he had to say.
Well, first, Lester, when it comes to threatening NATO countries, we have something very powerful called Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. Russia knows that, and that's exactly why, among other things, one of our responses has been to shore up NATO's defenses, to put more forces, to put more equipment on its eastern flank, the countries closest to Russia, to deter any aggression that Russia might be contemplating against NATO countries.
So this will be about military support to beef up the NATO countries, but also discussions of support to help Ukraine and likely some support for humanitarian needs and perhaps even discussion of what would happen to refugees as we're seeing Ukrainians being displaced. So we expect some of that to be part of that meeting today. Joe?
So, Kelly, the White House released these staggering sanctions yesterday. So far, nothing has deterred Putin. Talk about these latest sanctions. What does the White House hope they'll accomplish?
Well, this is about punishing Putin and punishing the Russian economy. And by doing that, by attacking Russian banks and prominent Russian figures, oligarchs, elites, and making it harder for them to do business. And some of these new financial sanctions would stop them from doing business in a number of currencies, the dollar, the yen, the euro, doing those sorts of things. Also, limiting access for imports of things like semiconductors, things they would need for their own technology. All of that is intended to punish by strangling the Russian economy, crippling their ability to function economically. These are stepped up sanctions, maybe not as far as they could ultimately go. For example, they didn't sanction Putin personally, although that might be more symbolic than effective. And they didn't go after what's known as the SWIFT system, which is a communication system in the financial markets. But the president says these are the strongest sanctions ever done and that they could be very effective in trying to deter Putin now that he's taken this action and to cause suffering in Russia, which could compel Putin to pull back. That's the hope.
Kelly O'Donnell in Washington. Kelly, thank you.
Let's now bring in NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell, who's also in Washington with some more reaction from lawmakers. Leanne, good morning. So last week, a Senate sanctions package to punish Russia didn't end up going anywhere. What kept that package from being passed then? And now that Russia has fully moved into Ukraine, we're seeing a full-scale invasion. Is there anything new in the works right now?
Good morning, Savannah. So the reason sanctions were not able to be passed on Capitol Hill is there were disagreements in part on the timing of the sanctions. Republicans really wanted sanctions pre-invasion. Well, now we know that time has come and gone. But there was another reason why they couldn't reach an agreement as well, and that was because Democrats wanted sanctions on what Kelly just mentioned, the SWIFT international system, which is a verification system for international bank transfers. And Republicans didn't think that that was necessary because you have to have European support in order to go that route. Republicans wanted secondary sanctions. That is sanctions on entities who do business with the people who were primarily sanctioned. Now, those sanctions, so that was stuck in Congress, and it turns out that President Biden yesterday didn't impose either one of those, the secondary sanctions or pulling Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. And so there are still conversations ongoing on Capitol Hill, and so we'll see where they go. But ultimately, the president is able to act unilaterally, and what Congress is just kind of a support system in this situation. Savannah.
Now, Leanne, we know the president has said, of course, he won't send troops to Ukraine. It is not a NATO nation. So outside of sanctions, what other actions can Congress take to punish Russia or help Ukraine? I think a lot of people are thinking, oh, my goodness, they need help. What can be done here?
Yeah, honestly, there's not a whole lot, especially to punish Russia outside of sanctions. As far as helping Ukraine, they could give humanitarian aid or military aid to Ukraine. And that is something that is being widely discussed. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell talked about this yesterday. Let's listen to what he said last night.
Assuming there's a significant insurgency, to support that insurgency with weapons and intelligence and everything that will help them make the Russians pay a severe price for this invasion.
But House lawmakers got an unclassified briefing last night, and in that briefing, Defense Secretary Austin admitted that there's a problem with resupplying Ukrainians with military aid. The fact that Russia controls the airspace, they can't get anything in through airplanes, and the land transfers for that military equipment is becoming increasingly difficult as Russia controls more and more territory in Ukraine. Savannah.
All right, Leanne Caldwell, thank you so much.
Coming up, our breaking news coverage continues as this invasion unfolds in Ukraine.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.